All right, guys. Last time we ended off, we were discussing the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and he said, Adim Zomimim, that admit that they conspired against the witness don't pay the Hazamah penalty, which is the reciprocal penalty, based on their own confession. And we were discussing the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva, if you remember, considers the Hazamah penalty a fine rather than compensation. And there's a rule that you don't pay a fine by your own admission, but only based on evidence. How do we know that? In the 64th daf of Bavli in Bet, we learnt that it brings that verse from Shmot, Exodus chapter 22, verse 8. And what does it say? To whom the judges will find guilty shall pay twofold for his fellow. So what's it saying is that when you study the kefil payment for theft, because Bava Kama deals with damages, the double payment imposed on a thief is basically the repayment of the compensatory amount stolen. So if it's 100 zuz that the thief stole, he pays the 100, and the fine or penalty itself is 100% fine of the compensation. So in total, 200 zuz is paid. And if it uses the pasuk, to whom the judges will find guilty shall pay twofold to his fellow, what do we infer? That only when it's a case where the judges say that he owes to his fellow, then the penalty is invoked, the knas. Okay? But that's because you aggravated the court, you needed the testimony of witnesses. But if you admit to the relevant party or to even the legal system that you yourself stole the money, you only have to pay as compensation that which you stole. It's only if you start to play games. So Rabbi Akiva, let me just, who knows why he considers this a fine and not a penalty? Well, sorry, a fine, which is a penalty. Why does he consider this a knas, a fine, which is a penalty, as opposed to compensation? Kevin?
Fine, it's for who Rabbi Akiva. I'll have a guess because it's not it's not the full amount that the person incurred as a loss. Uh, it's a it's for basically for committing a indiscretion, and that's what the courts do. But over and above a compensation payment, sometimes they do this as well. So
That's a relevant
for
point. That's a relevant point. But what are the factors that categorize a penalty? So I'm just going to go through this quickly. So Rabbi Akiva's opinion is shared obviously by some, not by all, but generally with a fine, it's a set amount. So for example, it brings the case of a person that's married to Naira, which is a girl that's still under father care in the first 6 months of puberty, technically. And when they engaged, he accuses her of not being faithful. Obviously, there's no witnesses, otherwise, she'd get the death penalty. And it's found out later he was slandering her name. So there's silver pieces. I think the defamer gets about, I think it's 50 or 100 silver pieces for rape. There's also a set amount. So generally, when it's a set amount, it's a fine. When it's not a set amount, like for example, a tam ox, but it's set maybe to the value of the body of the attacking animal. And Lance asked a great question: why is that? It doesn't make any sense. Well, I don't understand it either. But we do say that a mammon compensation is for full damages from choice property loans. The reason why it's from choice property is you can get rid of it quickly. So if the person doesn't have the cash to pay you and they give you choice property, even though it's a small amount of property, you can get rid of it easily compared to a larger tract of land that is of lower quality. So in other words, smaller property but higher value, you get rid of easier than medium grade, medium size, or lower grade, larger property. So they say from choice property, full payment or cash. If you don't have that, to whatever funds you'll get. But in the Tam Ox case, it's half payment damages, which is considered a knas, because your ox is tam, it's a strict warning, up to the value of the body of the attacking animal. We used an example before. So Rabbi Akiva says that this particular case of Eidim Zomamim is considered to be a fine because he says you didn't cost the damaged party anything because you didn't damage them. Your testimony, if it was successful, would have resulted in that person losing. But since you confessed before the Eidim Zomamim, there was no conviction of the innocent defendant, and therefore you didn't cost him anything because you, by your own admittance, said, I'm a plotting witness. And therefore, since you didn't cost him anything, then you shouldn't have to pay anything. And he says, well, then why is it a fine? So it's a fine because say you had been successful. Say you had been successful. Then you don't pay anything as the Eidim Zomamim. So in other words, it's not compensation because compensation would imply what you cost, you end up paying. And in this particular case, if your plot was successful and you cost the person money, then there's no reciprocal punishment for the Eidim Zomamim. So yes, you cost that person, but we don't make it compensation because it's only in the event of a successful plot that goes through that the Eidim Zomamim are off the hook because they're fully responsible in Shemaim, but they don't get to pay in this world. But if their plot fails and they are caught to be Eidim Zomamim, then in that case they pay. So in that case, if they pay, have they cost the defendant anything, yes or no?
No.
Exactly. So what happens is there was a verdict granted and the defendant had to pay. But before that case, the first set of witnesses were testified against by the second set that said they weren't there at that location. And based on that, they were charged with being Eidim Zomamim, and what they intended to make the other pay, they pay. But the important thing here is the defendant did not lose any money. So compensation is when you cost the other party money and you're paying that amount of money. So one would think it's compensation. Why? Lance, why would you think it's compensation initially as opposed to a fine? Hello? Are you on mute?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your reasoning? I'm questioning each of the guys.
So why is compensation is basically
Why would you think it's compensate? Why would a person, because Rabbi Akiva is one opinion, the Tanna Kamma is a different opinion, which is the general opinion by the rabbis that are anonymous. In other words, it's a general, it's not a specific rabbi that's pointed out, and unanimous, meaning there are if not the majority, certainly an equal portion that feel that it's compensation. Seems that Rabbi Akiva is a standalone opinion that it's a penalty. And he said it's a penalty because what you're wishing to do to the defendant hasn't cost the defendant anything. And therefore, if you're caught in the act of Eidim Zomamim, you're forced to pay a reciprocal penalty of what you intended to do to that victim. That is not compensation because the victim hadn't ended up paying. But why would the other rabbis consider it compensation?
Because of the intent.
Okay, so
you intended to do it.
You close. In fact, it's the opposite way around, but Lance's answer is correct. So Rabbi Akiva is actually working on intent, not verdict. In other words, the verdict is compensation. Let me just switch it around, Lance, but in concept you're right. The rabbis say that since as a plotting witness or plotting witnesses, the verdict that was carried out against the defendant was that you did cost him 100 zuz for when you accused him of theft, for example, then it was only when the second set of witnesses said that the first set were not at that location was the verdict not carried out. And since the verdict would have cost the defendant 100 zuz, the Eidim Zomimim pay 100 zuz. Intent is nothing. Rabbi Akiva is saying intent is everything, but the intent itself didn't really end up being successful. In other words, if you are successful with the intent, and you get the person to pay, but sorry, if you are successful with the intent, but the verdict isn't carried out, that's a fine because you haven't cost the defendant anything. So intent is what you pay on, but in terms of verdict, it's quid pro quo, it's compensation. Do you get what I'm saying? And I'll give you the source for it. It's just before the fifth daf. I'll show you privately in Schottenstein. Do you get what I'm saying? So it doesn't matter which way you view it, Lance, but it's you correct. In other words, it's compensatory in the sense that it matches the amount a person sought to cost the defendant. It's not a fixed amount. So that's why the rabbis say it's compensation. The fact of it, it's based on verdict. If the Eidim Zomimim had a verdict against the defendant, then the Eidim Zomimim have to compensate him with that loss. If the verdict isn't carried out, if it is carried out, they get away with it in this world, but not in Shemaim. So the rabbis say it's based on verdict, and Rabbi Akiva on intent. And he's saying on intent, you could have done anything you want, but it wasn't carried out. So on that intent, they punished with paying a penalty. But it doesn't matter which way you do it. You get the bottom line of what he's saying is that there was no actual cost. And as far as the rabbis are concerned, because it matches what you intended to cost that defendant, whether it's verdict-based or intent-based, it's not a fixed amount, and therefore it would mimic the compensation what you intended to do to the victim. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions? Lance, you can ask if you're arguing. It's not a problem. Tell me what.
So you basically are paying the amount you try to. Originally, you had the intent to steal that amount of money, but then you confessed. So you only pay the amount you intended to steal. There's no penalty.
Yeah, so as far as Rabbi Akiva is concerned, because it's based on your own confession and you haven't had the judges basically issue a verdict, so to speak, then you can't, for your own confession, you can't be made to pay a penalty. It's only when the judges have made the verdict can you do it. So
you can only confess prior to there being a verdict. You can't, after the verdict, say take it back.
Yeah, well, the whole question, the Gemara that's going to come out now is, can you retract testimony? And that's what's going to come out in this whole discussion now, which we're going to deal with. But just know that the rabbinic opinion, apart from Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva says that there was no actual loss for Eidim Zomimim, because if the plot had been successful, then you don't get the reciprocal penalty anyway. If the plot was not successful, then you haven't cost the person anyway. So therefore, it's a fine. In other words, if you were caught out, you wouldn't have cost the defendant money, and therefore it's a penalty. Do you get what I'm saying? If you were caught out, guys, then you don't cost the defendant anything, and therefore it's a penalty. He hasn't lost. If you weren't caught out, then in any case, Eidim Zomimim says you don't pay if you were successful in this world. Well, we don't pay in the courts in this world. You might be paid by Hashem, but certainly in the next world. And then the rabbis are saying that it's compensation because the amount is what you sought to damage from the other party. Do you see how they see it opposite? Yes or no questions quickly? Guys,
Good.
stop pulling teeth. Are you with? All right. So let's go on. So Rabbi Akiva considers the hazama penalty a fine rather than compensation, and one does not pay a fine based on his own admission, but only on the basis of evidence. Meaning, if you come there before the verdict is drawn and you said, listen, I did wrong, etc., etc., we come to think in this point of the Gemara, it's fine until the verdict is given, exactly as Lance said. So the Gemara says, look, can we find any evidence for the fact that Hazama is considered a fine by more than Rabbi Akiva? And Rabbah said, recognize that this is so because they have not actually done anything and yet they are executed and they pay the reciprocal penalty. So Rabbah is actually talking about the case in Sanhedrin in 89a with the Eidim Zomimim that they intended to have a Bas Kohen killed along with the person that they accused her of having an affair with. So therefore, if they were caught out before anybody was executed, they hadn't done anything successful by having those people executed, and yet they are executed and they pay reciprocal penalty of intent. So it's clear from this that the penalty they pay can't be a form of compensation since they pay what the victim has not yet suffered, a loss. Okay? So in other words, they're punished by the court only if the sentence obtained against the victim has not been enforced irreversibly, and there's nothing more irreversible than a death penalty. You can't countersue. So since they're subject to the penalty only if they're not actually done anything, in other words, they were caught up before the verdict was carried out, it's obvious then that the penalty is not a payment for any sort of damage. So it has to be categorized as a fine according to Rabbah. And Rav Nachman gives a different support, but he's in agreement. He said, you can see evidence of this, for the money about which they are testified is still in the hands of the rightful owner, and yet they pay the Hazama penalty. So as far as Rav Nachman is concerned, he's using an example of a monetary case, and Rabbah is using the case of a death penalty capital offense with Eidim Zomim. So the Gemara said, look, what's the essence of this point made by Rav Nachman? Because it's not that he said anything different to Rabbah. He's just using different wording, and his proof is monetary as opposed to capital offense. So what is Rav Nachman adding? And the Gemara is saying that no, then he's not adding anything. He's actually just agreeing with Rabbah and saying that Rabbah is bringing a capital case, but whether it's a capital case or a monetary case or corporal punishment, they're both in agreement that the rules of reciprocal punishment cannot be anything other than a penalty, because in order to get the reciprocal punishment, you can't be successful in getting the defendant to be punished in that particular manner. Otherwise, you don't get the reciprocal punishment. Okay, so the Gemara now is citing a statement of Rav and analyzing it. So Rav Huda said in the name of Rav. So bearing in mind, often you'll have a case where you hear Rav's opinion, but that's Rav's opinion according to Rav Yehuda. Sometimes you might hear a different contradicting opinion by Rav that another rabbi is going to bring out, and then the two of them have to have a debate in terms of where they're sourcing from. So Rav is one of the Tanaim. So Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, a Zomim witness pays according to his share. So now we kind of going off on a bit of a tangent, and we're saying, all right, so apart from this penalty, etc., what's this meaning of pays according to his share? So if we say, for example, guys, that this conspiring witness pays half and the other one pays half. In other words, say they sought to cost this defendant 200 zuz, then each of them pays 100 zuz each. And we already learned that each of them share the load. But that's only in regard to a monetary sentence, but they don't divide the load in terms of lashes. So what we learn in the fifth daf is that when we say 40 lashes, it's actually 40 minus 1 is 39. Each one of them gets half the amount of lashes. Whereas each one of them gets 39 lashes. Now, I don't know if that's a case specifically because you can't exactly do 19 and a half lashes. I don't know where you get the half from. So I don't know if that's why each one gets the full amount. But as far as lashes are concerned, each one gets the full gamut of lashes that they sought to inflict upon this individual. And if you think about it, it does make sense because this individual was going to suffer 39 lashes on his own. And in order for them to have a kapora, if they're only getting half the amount of lashes, there's no ways that that would atone for the full amount if each one is only putting half the skin in the game. Whereas from a monetary point of view, the defendant is compensated and he doesn't have to make a profit out of the Adim Sumamim. That's the case. He can't come off better off. He just needs to be compensated. And therefore, if each of them pays half, that would suffice to compensate the defendant. Does that make sense so far? Any questions? Now, not everybody.
Damon, can I ask you a slightly different question?
Sure.
What happens if the injured party forgives the Eidim Zomimim? Can the Eidim Zomimim can they be let off their knas or their compensation?
So, firstly, Kevin, I'm not sure, but I think here one of the issues is that it's why it's treated so harshly is not only that they sought to convict an innocent person, but they were corrupting the justice system. So I'm not sure if the Sanhedrin or the Beis Din would be so easy to forgive, because every time you have a case of Eidim Zomimim, it makes the justice system look more ineffectual. In terms of
Yes.
of whether or not they would forgive it, it's probably unlikely that a defendant that almost would lose his life or his amount of money or lose half of his spine with the lashing is going to be in such a forgiving mood. But let's just say I don't know if it's his right to do so if it's set by biblical law. In other words, it might not be his to forgive. Do you get what I'm saying?
And there's a term in South Africa called defeating the ends of justice.
Yeah, exactly.
Where they waste, yeah.
So also for a negative commandment and a biblical derisa compared to Rabbanan, there are lashes involved. So for their own kapora, they might not, forgiveness might be good, but it's certainly, I don't see why the Sanhedrin would necessarily allow defeating the ends of justice, as you said. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the individual's rights could supersede that of the biblical instruction. What's this whole point that they divide the monetary sentence, but they don't divide the sentence of lashes? Because since you know that, there's no need for Rav Yehuda to have taught this rule in the name of Rav. Why? In other words, if it's saying it's taught in coming up in the fifth daf, why teach it now? Why repeat it? So then there's another description. It says, okay, so maybe Rav means that when only one of the witnesses is proven to be a plotting witness, but not the other, what does this actually mean? Is that there are two witnesses, and the two witnesses that go and testify against an individual, and a second set of witnesses and come and say, listen, out of Shmuel and Ruvain, we can't speak for Shmuel. We had no idea where he was on that day. But Ruvain couldn't have seen the crime in Santon because he was with us in Plettenberg Bay. So in other words, they've only got evidence against one of the pair of witnesses. We don't know if the other one was a conspiring witness, but certainly one is. So what we need to say is that it seems to suggest that Rav teaches that he pays half of the penalty that should be his, although his partner hasn't been proven to be a conspiring witness and therefore will consequently pay nothing. So that's the suggestion in the Gemara. Maybe Rav means that the one that's caught out pays his share. So if it's lashes, he gets fully lashed, and if it's monetary, only pays half the monetary, irrespective of whether or not the partner is either telling the truth or there's just not another set of witnesses that can say he wasn't at that proven location. And the Gemara said it can't be. Because the question is, does he pay anything in such a case? There is a brisa that teaches that a plotting witness doesn't pay money unless both of them have found to be zomimim. So therefore, Rav's teaching can't refer to this case. So now, let me just put you back to the step of the Gemara. So the initial proposal is that Rav Yehuda's teaching that Rav's saying that in a case when one of them is caught out to be a plotting witness, especially in a monetary case, it doesn't really address lashes, is that he should certainly pay his half. Okay? And then the Gemara is saying it can't be because there's a brisa that says both of them have to be found to be plotting witnesses in order to trigger the payment that each pays their share. So it's saying that, well, what does Rav refer to? Now, Rabbah is trying to explain this case of Rav now, not Rav Yehuda. And he's saying that the case to which Rav refers to is where he said that I have testified falsely, meaning he doesn't get caught up by a second set of witnesses, but he himself comes to a confession, exactly like Rabbi Akiva is saying, and said, listen, I was somewhere else at the time and I couldn't have seen what he saw. So in other words, his partner doesn't admit that he lied. But because the one witness says, listen, I was lying, I was plotting, in that case, it's suggested by Rabbah that Rabbah is referring to this case where he has to pay the penalty, but not more than his share. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, you could have three plotting witnesses. So in that particular case where you've got three plotting witnesses, and let's just do simple maths, they sought to take this defendant and make him pay 300 zuz. And the one says, listen, I wasn't part of this. He would pay a share of 100, he would pay a share of 100 zuz by his own confession, whereas initially it was suggested that Rav was saying there's only a second set of witnesses, and Rav is saying it can't be because there's a brisa that says they've all got to be found to be zomimim. So the only explanation Rava has on Rav is that this person testified of their own volition. But then,
Damon?
yeah,
Okay, you're raising some issues here. So generally, you have to have two witnesses to
correct.
testify.
Yes,
They have to testify. They have to be friends. They don't have to like see the same thing. They can see it from a different angle. They're not
correct.
together. They both witness something, but they don't know each other. Okay, they're strangers.
Yes,
So one of them testifies that one of them is false, which means the other one is still a witness, but his testimony isn't worth anything because there's only one witness. So he gets off the hook then, and he's not liable. It basically means there's no witness to the event.
no, that's not what I'm saying. I hear what you're saying. What I'm saying is in order to trigger Adim Zomimim, the Gemara is using an example.
Both must be found to be aided.
No, just
Must be plural.
can I answer your question? Will you give me a chance to answer you?
Sure.
So, if you have a look, then if you look at your Schottenstein on 3a1, okay, there's a note of note 3, okay, that brings it to the fore that if there is a third witness in a monetary case, in that particular case, if he confesses to be a plotting witness, he would pay his share out of his own testimony. That's the first thing. So the note is basically stating that you still can have a case where there are more than one witness, a minimum of two, but there can be more. And if the third one feels from his own testimony that he was plotting and admits he was lying, he does pay his share, according to Rava's opinion on Rav. Okay, that's a fact. Second thing of it is in order to be convicted of Eidim Zomimim, you would need a second set of witnesses to testify against that first set. Now, in a classical case, it's the second set of two witnesses saying that the first set were not at the location they said to have been witnessing that particular event. But the second set of witnesses can say, that only one of the witnesses was not at the event because they were somewhere else with the second set. In other words, the classic case that we learn simply when we introduce to the idea is the second set is basically saying that they in Plettenberg Bay, and the first set of witnesses that apparently viewed this incident in Sandton were with the second set at that time, at that date, in a different location. Then the Gemara gets more complicated and says that it can say that only one of the witnesses was with them at that time and place in a different location. It doesn't have to be that it's an ideal case that it's 2 against 2. The reason why the Gemara initially brings a case of 2 against 2 is that is the chidush, that is the novelty. Because generally when you have a case where you've got 2 witnesses contradicting another 2 witnesses by their testimony, but not in terms of the fact that they weren't at that location at the time, then the whole case gets cancelled because it's conflicting testimony. In other words, if it's not seen to be an outright lie that they weren't even at that location at that time and place, then it could be a case where, as Lance was saying, that witnesses see things from different angles and that there could be so much confusion that the case is thrown out of court. Or we said that one of the witnesses could be caught in an infidelity and doesn't want to lose his marriage and custody of his children, so he's lying. The fact of Adam Zomamim is not about lying witnesses. It's about witnesses that are plotting to have somebody innocent convicted by saying they saw a particular event. And the second set is saying that they were not at that event, or one of the witnesses was not at an event. And then it was proved that they were plotting, or he was plotting falsely against the other fellow. So Adam Zomamim is about saying that he wasn't at that location, which is purely a plot or conspiring of evil. It's not about lying about the facts or even having a conflicting fact resolution. But Lance is right that on the testimony of one witness, it's not strong enough to convict. However, on the testimony of yourself, you can convict yourself in terms of a penalty, but not for capital cases. Okay, so Lance, does that make it clear? We're not saying that with a set of witnesses that out of the 3 that were there, they were saying that the third one wasn't necessarily there, because even if the third one wasn't there and the 2 saw it, it could be strong enough to have a conviction because it's 2 witnesses. So we're saying that in a standard case of 2 witnesses, Adam Zomamim could say that one of the witnesses or both were not there to view the crime or the alleged offense. Or if there were 3 sets of witnesses and a second set came, they could have said one of the witnesses out of the 3 was not there. But it's not enough, according to Rav's opinion on Rav, to make the person pay from a second set. It would have to be by his own confession, because we learnt earlier on, according to the Brisa, that a single conspiring witness doesn't pay unless all the witnesses that come together, whether it's one other person or 2 other people, are found to be Adam Zomamim. In other words, you don't pay your share unless they're all convicted. It's only in a case of self-incrimination when the other witness isn't admitting to lying. Because initially the suggestion by Rav is that one of the Zomamim, one of the plotting witnesses, can pay on the testimony of others, whether he gets, if it's monetary, he pays his share. If it's lashes, he gets the full amount, and so does the other person if they're caught. But then the Brisa comes and said it can't be that case, because both have to be caught to be Adam Zomamim in order that the one pays. In other words, it's conviction of both. So Rav says, well, then how would Rav explain it? And the only way Rav explains is to say the person has to admit of their own volition that they lied, but you might have a case where the second witness doesn't admit to anything. So if he admits to himself, he must pay the penalty. But then we're going to say, well, then Rabbi Akiva is saying he doesn't pay the penalty because by your own admission you don't pay. So then we're going to go through that. In the meantime, I want Kevin to teach us as the
Now
quickly.
I've got 1 minute, Damon. Literally, I've got
Yeah,
someone
yeah.
waiting for me on
Yeah. Okay,
a
so we'll
student.
keep Lance here for a minute. So teach us for a minute quickly.
Okay, just one thing. Okay, I said to her, okay. Um, I listened to a podcast of Rabbi Darren Platsky. Sure you've heard of him, but maybe not as rabbi. Say Rabbi Podleship. I'll talk about that tomorrow. And there are different opinions as to attire during davening. And some, I can't remember all the sources. Some Rabbonim say as long as you cover your private parts. So davening in going to shul in shorts and a t-shirt is not the end of the world. Obviously, one should try and dress as smartly as possible if they can, but that is what some opinions say. As long as you cover sensitive areas of your body. Okay, on that note, I need to go.
All right, Lance, just stay for a sec. You'll go, Kev. I just want to finish the Lance you got to. Lance, is there anything that you that doesn't make sense? You can ask me with pleasure.
Okay, so basically, aiding Zorin must be two people conspiring. It's not a case of two witnesses who don't know each other and one is false. That isn't conspiring witnesses. If they are conspiring, it means there are two people who are discussing it and who are making up a story. That's aiding women. That's conspiring. Otherwise,
Yes.
it's just a case of not valid witnesses.
Well, the fact of it is the reason why you need two is enough to convict. A single witness cannot convict. The point that's going to come out at these points are nuances. Is that what happens if one is caught? In other words, do they have to pay anything, or is it reliant on both of them being caught? So how can one be caught? There's only two ways: self-admittance, or a second set of witnesses can't verify the location of one of the witnesses, but the other, they say they definitely weren't that event because they were with us in a different province. So in other words, that's the only way. But it might not be what we learn is Rabbi Akiva, Rav was initially thought to say that, well, then he just pays his share if the one's caught. But there's a brisa that says it's you can't be made to pay unless both are convicted. There's no reciprocal penalty if one is convicted. And then the question that Rava asks on Rav is by somebody bound. Rav must mean by somebody by their own admittance. Then a person might be forced to pay. But now we have to deal with Rabbi Akiva that says you don't have to